coming down the western side of the mountain in spring was different. All of the threats were left behind. Not that the plants and the animals were different, for they weren't. Oh, maybe the herbivores were a little bit smaller and shyer, but they were still the same horn-headed targets, if slightly smaller and therefore harder to hit. And the palm trees and the pines were the same, but it all felt bland, like food without spice or an adventure without risk. It was life, but it was lacking. And surely the predators were lacking. Zeezee had walked up to a horned beast with a crushed and bloodied leg, a victim of a random rolling rock. He led it back to the pass haven, limping, where it became dinner. There were no large predators around. They'd have smelled that blood from miles away, and yet none came to claim such an easy meal. Yes, there were dangers, but the dangers came in more subtle forms, and, after a few days, the hunters left the women at the safety of Pass Haven and went on what they said would be only an 8-day trip. The women, knowing where the men were going, warned them, chided them, and tried to work their wiles on them. But to no avail. Nothing good would come of it. The hunters went to the permanent haven of the brewers, the clan of the cave beers. 8 days turned into 15, as the women had predicted, as the hunters labored day by day to bring wood to the brewers. They bartered for drinks for the evening and for a barrel to bring home. The hunters hand-gathered grain in the meadows, which had been covered by a winter's snow, and had dug up roots in the newly thawed marshes, and had generally did as they were bid. When the men had had enough of being ordered about by the Beer Haven hussies, they took their barrel back to Pass Haven and faced the wrath of their women. 2 weeks wasted, and with only one soon-to-be-emptied keg to show for it. The women lamented that they'd found food for themselves and their children, and cleaned and cooked and stayed warm and safe, and they had done just fine without any stupid, smelly, grunting men around. And the hunters negotiated as well, and when the hangovers went away, things slowly got back to normal. The cask, once emptied of its potent product, was used in the Haven's kitchen to hold water and to hold memory. The women wouldn't forget. 2 weeks wasted for that thing? And the men suggested moving to the Brewer's Valley, and the women said that was never going to happen. Zeezee suggested that he could be an apprentice to the brewers and bring back the knowledge of brewing to Pass Haven, rather than one small cask. The argument accelerated back towards cruising speed. He wandered down to the river to find somewhere to think. Someplace quiet, someplace without distractions. Perhaps under a waterfall. I have a few theories on civilization. The first is that civilization happens because of war, that we have to band together, because if we don't, the invading horde will erase our genetics. The second is that communication technology, writing, improves survival by extending memory, and that out of that grows civilization. The third theory is that beer is the reason for civilization. That the technology for grain farming and fermentation vessel production is actually the driving force. Oh, and because drunk women get pregnant more often than sober ones, beer makes a population grow faster than a strictly sober society. The fourth theory is that civilization is here because God said, behave! I can't think of any other reasons at this moment. Zeezee sat on a log that leaned out over the river. The river sped up slightly, going under the log, which washed out a deep place where fish like to hide. With a metal hook on a string, any kind of insect as bait, and a small stone to sink the baited hook and line, fish seemed to line up to be caught. None were as large as the vest fish he'd caught a month ago in the frozen river on the other side of the Great Mountains, but that's okay. A fish that big would break this line. Duckweed came and sat by him. He cleaned the fish, laying the boneless, scaleless, and headless bodies on a freshly cut palm leaf. Zeezee now was able to use their innards as bait. That was faster than hand-catching hoppers. You really stirred them up with that comment about learning how to brew beer, said Duckweed. The men think it's brilliant, and the women think it's horrible. And what do you think? I know for a fact that it would work better than the men think it will, and that it will bring in more problems than the women think it will. They don't see that trading out beer brings in a lot of wealth, and that the wealth they would attract would attract problems like these fish heads will attract flies. Our hunters came back after a week or two, and now they're out hunting once again. We'll raft a load of these hides down the river in a few weeks, and it might have enough to trade for a Gates mainframe for Ford Falls Haven, though other provisions need to be purchased first. What happens when hunters don't go out and hunt? The animals are safer, and we lose the food, and we've no trade goods for a new haven. Look, right now we're gaining wealth as a byproduct of food. You don't gain that kind of wealth as a byproduct of beer. You get songs in a haven hall, not around an ice hole. You get lots of wasted time and not as much productive effort. Duckweed chopped the head off a fish for emphasis. With beer, you get more playing and less working. Fun. Scrape, scrape, scrape. Who needs it? Duckweed slapped another descaled fish carcass onto the pile for further emphasis. Fun doesn't sound that bad. I lived in a beer hall for a year. Take it from me. There's a lot of time wasted on hollering and hussies and hangovers. You did? You know how to make wine and beer? Yeah, it ain't that hard. But don't you tell that lot up there. Trust me. Scrape, scrape, scrape. We're better off without it. Zeezee waited for the next bite. Duckweed rinsed the fishiness off his hands and cleaned his knife. Zeezee looked at the back of Duckweed's hands, at the marks there. Not the marks that came with decades of use, the scars and blemishes of time, but the birthmarks that everyone was born with. Duckweed had 2 on his left hand and 1 on his right. Zeezee looked at the back of his own wrists. He had only 1 birthmark on each, and the same on each hand. On the backs of his hands was the letter Z. See, the gloves came off. And now you can see. This is one of the embedded points of the story, a theme that will take some time to develop. Also, in no way is this palm reading, okay? This is much different, and not just because it's on the back of the wrist and not in the cup of the hand. I remember a 5th theory about civilization. It deals with bureaucrats, which form on a government like mussels on a pier piling. I'm less clear on this one, but bureaucracies are incredibly good at perpetuating themselves. They may be parasitic, but they unify the consumption of a large host of people. Is the population the consumer of government or the consumed?